A tariff is a tax on imports. Tariffs are most commonly levied against individual goods or services. Here's an alternative definition. It's designed to protect the domestic producer against the greed of his customers. Before we can talk about the impact of a tariff on economic welfare, we need a way of measuring that welfare. Using milk as our example, we will show how total economic welfare can be measured using consumer surplus and producer surplus. Economic welfare is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the total amount buyers would have been willing to pay for a product minus the amount they actually paid. Producer surplus is the total amount sellers receive minus the cost of producing that quantity of output. Consider the market for milk. The demand curve slopes downward with a vertical intercept of $4.50. The choke price, the price that makes quantity demanded equal to zero, is $4.50 per gallon. The equilibrium price is $3.20 per gallon. Equilibrium quantity demanded will be 10,000 gallons. At a price of $4, quantity demanded will be 3,846.15 gallons. Everyone who is willing to pay $4 but actually pays $3.20 receives $4 minus $3.20, or 80 cents in excess value. This transaction will give those buyers 80 cents per gallon of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the value received by consumers in excess of the price they pay for a good or service. Different people will value any product in different ways. Each person values any product differently, but all pay the same price. Most buyers receive value in excess of the price they pay. The demand curve is also a statement of willingness to pay, the value that each buyer places on a particular good. The distance between the demand curve and the market price at any specific quantity measures the consumer surplus generated when that quantity is purchased. Consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the market price up to the point of equilibrium. Consumer surplus is the area of the shaded triangle labeled CS. In welfare economics, it's important to remember how to calculate the area of a triangle. Base times height divided by 2. The base is 10,000 minus 0. The height is $4.50 minus $3.20. Consumer surplus is $6,500. The supply curve for milk slopes upward with a vertical intercept of $1.50. The equilibrium price is $3.20 per gallon. Equilibrium quantity supplied will be 10,000 gallons. At a price of $2, quantity supplied will be 2,941.18 gallons. Some milk producers would be willing to sell milk for $2 per gallon. But every producer gets the $3.20 market price. Those willing to sell milk for $2 receive $3.20 minus $2, or $1.20 in excess value. This transaction will give those sellers $1.20 per gallon of producer surplus. This is the difference between the minimum price sellers are willing to accept for a given quantity and the single price they all receive. Producer surplus is the value received by sellers in excess of the minimum price they would accept for a good or service. Different sellers have different marginal production costs. Each seller has a minimum willingness to accept, but all receive the same price. Most sellers receive value in excess of their marginal production cost. The supply curve is also a statement of willingness to accept, the minimum amount sellers are willing to accept for a particular good. The distance between the supply curve and the market price at any specific quantity measures the producer surplus generated when that quantity is sold. Producer surplus is the area between the supply curve and the market price up to the point of equilibrium. Producer surplus is the area of the shaded triangle labeled PS. Like consumer surplus, it's important to remember how to calculate the area of a triangle. Base times height divided by 2. The base is 10,000 minus 0. The height is $3.20 minus $1.50. Producer surplus is $8,500. Economic welfare is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. For this example, economic welfare is $15,000. Economic welfare is the entire shaded area between the demand and supply curve to the point of equilibrium. In international trade, the small country assumption is roughly the same as perfect competition. We assume the country can buy all of a product that it wants at the world price without having any effect on that price. That implies the world supply curve is horizontal from the small country's viewpoint. If the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price, consumers will gain if the country engages in international trade. At the world price, PW, supply is completely elastic. The supply curve is horizontal. The world price is PW. At that price, domestic quantity demanded will be Q2. Domestic producers will supply Q1. The difference, Q2 minus Q1, will be imported. Consumer surplus increases considerably compared to autarky. The reason is the lower price buyers are paying. Consumer surplus is now the area below the demand curve and above the world price up to Q2. Producer surplus decreases considerably compared to autarky. The reason is the lower price sellers are receiving. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the world price line up to Q1. There is a net increase in economic welfare equal to area EW. The triangle above the world price but below both the demand and supply curves is the net increase in economic welfare created by trade. The government imposes a tariff of amount T. Modeling a tariff is easy. Just shift the world price line up by the amount of the tariff. The domestic price will rise to PW plus T equals PT. The new domestic price will be PT. The higher domestic price has the usual effects. Quantity demanded falls from Q2 to Q2 star. Quantity supplied rises from Q1 to Q1 star. The quantity imported falls. Government collects revenue from the tariff. Quantity demanded falls from Q2 to Q2 star. Quantity supplied rises from Q1 to Q1 star. With no tariff, consumer surplus was A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. After the tariff is imposed, consumer surplus is E plus F. The net loss to consumers is A plus B plus C plus D. Consumers are unambiguously worse off because of the tariff. The reason is the higher domestic price. With no tariff, producer surplus was G. After the tariff is imposed, producer surplus is G plus A. Area A is transferred from consumers to producers. Producers are better off because of the tariff. This affects the income distribution but not overall welfare. Resources are transferred from consumers to producers. The government collects tariff revenue equal to T times the number of units imported, Q2 star minus Q1 star. Area C is transferred from consumers to the government. This is another income distribution effect. Consumers lose A plus B plus C plus D, but A is transferred to producers and C is transferred to the government. The net loss to the economy is B plus D. Area D is called the deadweight loss. This loss is caused by some potential consumers leaving the market. These folks would be willing to pay PW, but are unwilling to pay PT. Think of PW as the actual marginal cost of one more unit. In effect, buyers are paying a price greater than marginal cost. This deadweight loss is similar to the same loss created by firms with market power. The deadweight loss is the area below the demand curve, above the world price line, and between Q2 and Q2 star. Area B is called the efficiency loss. The triangle B is the additional cost to the nation when it tries to make the extra output Q1 star at home instead of buying it in the world market at price PW. Area B is a resource misallocation and a net loss to the nation because the same goods, Q1 star minus Q1, could have been acquired without giving up this amount. While this is also a deadweight loss, the term efficiency loss focuses attention on the production side. The efficiency loss is the area below the supply curve, above the world price line, and between Q1 and Q1 star. Table 6.1 is a summary of the welfare effects of this tariff. Pay special attention to the last three rows: government revenue, deadweight consumption loss, and efficiency loss. All three are zero under free trade.
Take a look now at an alternative to tariffs as a way to reduce the amount of imports that come into a market. So a tariff is a direct way to limit the imports by raising the price of a good. A quantitative restriction instead just limits the quantity of the goods that come into the market. It could be as a share of the total market in the economy, or just a simple quantity per given year. So one of the advantages from a government standpoint of a quota or quantitative restriction as opposed to a tariff is that it provides more certainty. When you limit the quantity that can come in, you know exactly how much is going to be able to come into the country, barring smuggling. A tariff, on the other hand, if foreigners or importers pay the tax at the border, they can bring the product in. So you really don't know with certainty what the number of goods that will come into the market, and so don't know what the pressure will be on your domestic producers. So in this video, we're going to be examining a number of aspects of quantitative restrictions. One is to look at the effects of these measures on domestic prices, at domestic production, and ultimately on domestic consumers. We're going to see that there's going to be an important role for the allocation of licenses. Basically, that is a piece of paper that allows someone to bring a product into the market. If you have a physical quantity that's allowed in, the government needs to keep track of that, and when it reaches the limit, the border shuts down. And so the way that this is done is often through the allocation of a license at the border. And another important aspect that's going to be associated with these licenses is a concept called quota rent, which we will introduce in just a few moments. So let's start out with a basic supply and demand curve for an import competing industry. We have the red line, which is the free trade supply price. We're going to be looking at a small country case. The world will supply as much of this product as this importing country would want at $100. So that's the world price is $100. Q2 is demanded, Q1 is supplied domestically, and the difference, of course, is imported. So with a quota, there will be a limit to the amount that can be brought in. And let's assume that this quota, this quantitative restriction, is less than the original amount of imports. So at the original domestic price, there is too much demand relative to the supply that's brought from domestic and foreign producers. In particular, there's excess domestic demand at the free trade price. So when there's more demand than there is supply, the price has to rise. The price is going to rise domestically until the point where the foreign supply plus the domestic production equals the demand inside this market. So that for this particular quota, that would be a price such as PQ 110. So in this instance, we've got the domestic production is now at Q3, domestic consumption is Q4, and the difference that's imported is what is allowed by the government to come in. So what we see is that the quota raises the price inside the domestic market. So let's take a look at the impact on the various groups within the domestic economy. Domestic producers are going to gain A. That's the increase in producer surplus associated with the higher price. It's the difference in the price over the supply curve. Domestic consumers are going to face a loss of consumer surplus equal to A, B, C, D. That is the difference in the price over to the demand curve. And then we have a question about how the government is affected by this. With the tariff, they had government revenue directly through the import tax. The impact on the government in this instance is going to be unclear because it depends on how the licenses are allocated for the imports that come in. So we look at the welfare effects. We've got gains and losses outweighing each other on the domestic consumer and producer side. The producers gain at the expense of the domestic consumers. And we have this net effect of BD, which are the standard deadweight losses, very similar, in fact, exactly the same as with tariff. And then C, this is a loss to domestic consumers. It's not clear whether the government is going to earn this in terms of revenue, which is what we'll explore now. Now, an important part of this story is what's called a quota rent. Now, a quota rent is the difference between what foreigners were willing to bring this product into the market and what they're allowed to get if they're able to sell within this protected domestic market. Now, if a foreigner gets a license, gets to sell inside the domestic market, they sell it for $110. If they sell this same product anywhere else in the world, it's $100. The difference between those two is the quota rent. The foreigner would be willing to pay up to $10 in order to get access to this protected domestic market. Now, they would clearly prefer to pay nothing so that they can just pocket the extra profits associated with the protected market. But the government potentially can gain some revenue by charging foreigners for the right to sell inside the domestic market. So the net welfare effect is going to depend very much on how these quota licenses are allocated by the government. So let's say, for example, that the government auctions the quotas to foreign suppliers. They say, you are more than welcome to sell inside our market, but we're going to make you pay. Now, if there are lots of foreign producers that are competing to get access to this domestic market, then they would be willing to pay up to that area C in the previous graph. If that happens, there's going to be essentially the same revenue that the government would have earned with a tariff that is instead earned through the quota licenses sold competitively through an auction process. The government could also simply give away the licenses, give away the pieces of paper to foreigners who are interested in buying or selling this product inside the domestic market. If the licenses are given away to foreigners, then the net welfare effect is B and D, the standard deadweight losses, plus a transfer of C from domestic consumers, in effect, to the foreign producers. They get these higher profits associated with the protected market. Now, there's also a very real possibility of corruption in the allocations of licenses. Quotas are more frequently used in the developing world. They're banned more or less in manufactured goods in the developed world through WTO agreements. And so let's say that the licenses are sold on Thursday, but a person that controls the licensing process, say a bureaucrat, can meet with somebody on Monday, sell the license, pocket the money. Now, in that instance, the national welfare effects are a bit ambiguous. In the standard analysis that we've been doing, a transfer between two domestic agents has no net welfare effects. So through corruption, you would essentially have a transfer from domestic consumers who would pay higher prices, who would then be essentially paying indirectly to the corrupt bureaucrats. Now, this is an example where you clearly wouldn't want to think of those as being welfare neutral. There are all sorts of problems with a system that encourages corruption among government administrators. But nonetheless, if we do the analysis as we have been pursuing so far, the net welfare loss of corruption would only be B and D, because the C would be a transfer from consumers to the bureaucrats.
Now let's relax the small country assumption. Instead, we will assume that the country is large. This is similar to analysis of imperfect competition and firms with market power. In theory, it is possible for large countries to actually improve their national welfare with a tariff as long as their trading partners do not retaliate. If the world price of a product is less than the domestic price, economic welfare will be improved by trade. Welfare rises because buyers pay a lower price for the product. PW is less than the domestic autarky price. The country will import Q2 minus Q1 gallons of oil. The government imposes a tariff of amount T. The domestic price will rise to PW plus T equals PT. The tariff causes an increase in supply of this product in the rest of the world by Q2 minus Q1, the original quantity imported, minus Q2 star minus Q1 star, the post-tariff import quantity. Because the country is small, this increase in global supply has no impact on the world price. With no tariff, imports were Q2 minus Q1. With the tariff, imports are Q2 star minus Q1 star. The decrease in imports is equal to the increase in global supply in the rest of the world. Now assume the country has market power. That means the volume of trade in a particular good is a significant fraction of world trade. For example, in 2010, Australia produced about 1/3 of the global supply of bauxite used to make aluminum. Here is the sequence of events for a large country. 1. A large country, say the US, imposes a tariff of size T on oil imports. 2. The quantity of US oil imports falls. 3. The supply of oil in the rest of the world increases. 4. This causes the world price to fall. Now let's look at this in detail. Steps 1 and 2. The U.S. imposes a tariff on oil imports. That causes the domestic price to rise and the quantity of oil imported to fall. The new import quantity will be Q2 star minus Q1 star. Step 3. The difference between the pre-tariff import quantity and the quantity of imports with the tariff is added to the supply of oil in the rest of the world. Step 4. The world price of oil falls because supply has increased. The new world price is PW star. The domestic price is PW star plus T. This is less than the domestic price would have been if the country was small, PW plus T. The domestic price is PW star plus T. The deadweight loss, areas B plus D, is smaller than the deadweight loss in the small country case. Government tariff revenue is larger because the government now collects area G in addition to C. Areas B plus D are smaller than the small country deadweight loss. Government revenue is increased by area G. It bears repeating that the best overall welfare is achieved by not imposing a tariff at all.